out of our control. The Middle East is a tinderbox right now, ready to explode. Israel has to take care of business with Hamas. Hamas is dedicated to the destruction of Israel, with over 100 American hostages right now that nobody wants to talk about, over 150 Jewish hostages. What's going to take place in the news cycle? How will the eruption of Arab sentiment end up feeding into perhaps uprisings around the world? I can tell you that all of this is anticipated in what the Bible says, that in the end there will be wars and rumors of wars, but God has an end game in mind. That's why Jesus said, when these things begin to happen, see that you are not troubled, for these things must take place. Certain things must play out. The Middle East is where it's playing out. I want to be able to give you the information you need to understand ahead of time what's about to happen next. For your gift of any amount, I want to give you the 7 mountains, rise and fall of nations, because we're watching the repositioning of nations right now in history. And I want to also give you my teaching on the great end game, how history is all going to go back to the Middle East and how Israel is going to become the central issue. All of this is biblically foretold, and you don't need to be upset if you know what must take place. I want you to go to lancewallnau.com/breakout. I want you to have this for whatever amount you want to give. It's the rise and fall of nations, and it's the end game. It'll give you peace of mind to know in advance exactly what's about to take place next. And now, let's go ahead and get into the show. Welcome to the Lance Wallnau Show, and this is the firewall segment that we do for Real America's Voice. I can say that, can't I?
I think so.
Yeah, okay, well, because that's what we're still calling a firewall. So here's the deal. You've got the world with all of its focus back on Israel, the border, the globe. Now, I want to give a perspective here that is probably the only perspective that you won't hear on a secular news broadcast, is the prophetic timeline for how does this fit in with a scenario of what we know about. We talk about Great Awakening, we talk about a fourth turning, we talk about America and its crises. Here's a verse from the Bible that will make a great deal of sense to people if you have the advantage of this perspective. I like looking at the news objectively and seeing it for what's unfolding, and then looking at the lens of the Bible to see how do these two grids line up? Because when they line up, you have a real insight into what's happening that goes beyond the ordinary secular news cycle, left, right, conservative, liberal, progressive manipulation of news cycles. Jesus said something in Luke chapter 21, and it's a curious verse. Verse 24, he predicts the collapse of Jerusalem. This will be like 35 years before Jerusalem is laid under siege by the Romans. Now, Jesus' remarkable prophetic ministry is that he accurately foretells the events that are going to come to pass right up to the very end. Now, listen to this particular verse in light of what's happening in the Middle East. And he says that there is going to be, the surrounding of Jerusalem by armies. When you see the armies surrounding Jerusalem, recognize her desolation is near. Now stop and think about this. Mercedes, you're here in the studio today. You can shout out or shout me down or correct me if I go off track on this. Let me just cover this.
Okay, let's do it.
So you have the first century believers in Jerusalem. Don't forget, they had thousands of converts to this messianic movement. And the church in Jerusalem was where the apostolic ministries were going and coming until they finally went out. And you had this indigenous local presence led by, we believe, James, who was the brother of Jesus, curiously enough, who was the presiding elder over the church in Jerusalem. Now, we don't know how long James was in charge of Jerusalem, but for 30-some years, the church continues on, knowing that Jesus prophesied the destruction of the temple. Not one stone will be left upon another, he said, much to the shock and disbelief of his disciples. And they said, well, when is this going to happen? Tell us what the sign of this time will be. And Jesus warns them, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, recognize her desolation is near. Now, this is a footnote of history. The first century church actually saw the armies coming, surrounding Jerusalem from Titus of Rome because of the rebellion of the Jews against the Roman Empire. And they decided that the time had come for them to make their exodus. And so this is a historic fact. The first century church in Jerusalem exited out at the moment when Titus was beginning his siege of Jerusalem, and they left and they escaped, so that the church wasn't locked in Jerusalem during the one-year siege of Titus that was so brutal in history. Because they had the warning of Jesus, when you see the armies surrounding, that's when you make the exit. And that's exactly what they did. And then Jesus goes on in verse 24 and says, Jerusalem, the city, will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles or all other nations until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, this goes into history now. Now you have Israel literally being the centerpiece of God's cosmic clock. That's why Christians are so fixated on Israel, because among several reasons, that Israel becomes the centerpiece of global events in the time of the end. And who could have imagined that this little sliver of land, this little tiny sliver like the size of New Jersey, in this vortex between Egypt and Jordan and the landmass going up to Europe, who would have thought that this territory was going to be the centerpiece of global history? Well, especially when it was occupied by Bedouins and Arab tribes up until the 1940s. Suddenly the Jews come back. Now, when the Jews come back, there's immediate war. All the Arab nations, conspire against them to destroy the Jewish state. They overcame in 1948. But Jerusalem still was occupied and controlled under Arab control. The Jordanian state literally had that whole part of Israel, in a sense, assimilated. By the way, Jordan was a creation of Britain. It didn't exist. It wasn't like Jordan existed for thousands of years. It was a carved out territory that was part of the British solution to how to carve up the Middle East in the path of their exodus out of controlling that landmass of the Middle East. So Jordan has control of Jerusalem. Jordan, Egypt, Syria, they link together and decide that they're going to attack. In 1967, they go to war against Israel. In 1967, make a note of this, Israel, once again, in war, goes out and acquires control over all of Jerusalem now. You could say 1967 is the fulfillment of what Jesus is saying. Jerusalem is trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Meaning there's a timing for the Gentile nations. There is a time when the center of the focus of biblical history, prophecy, and eschatology, end-time events, locates itself back in the Middle East regarding the destiny of Israel. Jerusalem now is under the control of the Jews. And there's a classic moment when Moshe Dayan, as a tank commander, leading the infantry assault and the recovery of Jerusalem, the city, he's asking how far to go, and he's told to stop at a certain point, because he literally would have overtaken, the area of the mosques, etc., the Arab quarter. And so the Jews have control of Jerusalem. Moshe Dayan stops their aggressive activity in terms of occupying territory, and they establish now a peace settlement in 1967. But Jerusalem is no longer under the control of the Gentiles. It's now under the authority of the Jews, who's seeking peace with the Arab neighbors, allows the mosque and certain area to be sovereignly continue as a sacred site, a holy site. Although I might say, if you really study this, nowhere in the Quran is Jerusalem mentioned, not once. It's a holy site to the Christians and the Jews, not to the Muslims. But suddenly, Jerusalem becomes the centerpiece of Muslim attention and fixation, largely because the Jews now have control of Jerusalem. So the mosque becomes much more significant. It was Medina, Saudi Arabia. That's the centerpiece of Islamic history and Quran sacred locations, just as a footnote. The times of the Gentiles being fulfilled means that we're hitting a moment where from 1967 on, you're going to see Israel increasingly becoming the fulcrum of international, what can we say, the centerpiece of international issues. Now we bring that up. If we were to follow a chalk line of the journey of Arabs and Jews, it really leads to this whole misunderstood issue of a peace process. What you're hearing in schools, what you hear talked about in the academia, is the idea that there's a peace process going on. But let's talk about the actual dates here. The partition plan of 1947, which was the original offer for peace so that the Jews could have their own land, was rejected by the Arabs. The Egyptian-Israeli peace deal of 1979 is when the Arab states boycotted Egypt after Anwar Sadat made peace with Israel for almost a decade. The Arab states, however, were not in accord with Egypt and its plan with Israel. The Oslo Accords themselves, with Ehud Barak in 2000, the Camp David proposal, was rejected by Arafat, and a violent terror war was launched, resulting in the death of 1,184 Israelis. The Gaza withdrawal of 2005 resulted in Hamas being elected as the political leadership over Palestine. But the fact of the matter is, you'll see in every area where Israel attempts to negotiate, give up land, create peace, that it's refused, it's rebutted, or it's rejected outright. And this is an important part of history that is not seen in the academic circles of this debate over Israel. Clinton made the comment that Yasser Arafat, who is the PLO terrorist political leader representing Palestine, spent 14 days pretty much rejecting every offer that was given him for peace. Because, as we found out, he ended up with $1 billion in his own personal bank account by the time that he died. Where did that $1 billion come from? He was skimming off all the money that was coming in order to run a Palestinian terror state in opposition to the existence of Israel. What you have is a history of Israel seeking a two-state solution, which is why it's so absurd when you hear about two states. Hamas's charter is to destroy Israel. It isn't about land. It isn't about the right of two states. It's about the annihilation of the Jews and the acquisition of all that territory. So if you understand the history of it, you kind of develop a greater sympathy for the realization that Israel doesn't have a way out of this contest. It doesn't have, and when you talk about peace process, every attempt that has been made for peace is a failed peace process. We're going to come back in a second and take a look at this from a different angle. The times of the Gentiles are ending, meaning the time of the Jew and Israel is becoming the centerpiece of history, and we need to understand the frustration of the Middle East from a prophetic perspective. We'll be right back. What happens if a natural disaster takes place? We have these weird tornadoes that hit in the Midwest and in Texas, but look at the hurricanes in Florida. People can literally have their houses flooded, or they're in a situation where they have no food or access to groceries. Everyone needs at least a 4-week emergency food kit. And fortunately, My Patriot Supply has created a 4-week emergency kit. And these products will last for 25 years. The interesting thing is they give you a 2,000 calorie per day meal. And that's the key. Delicious and 2,000 calories a day, because that's what you're going to need to sustain yourself for 4 weeks in a crisis. We had a winter freeze here in Texas, of all places, and we had a couple of days where we had no electricity. I'm telling you something, this makes a huge difference. Mushroom rice pilaf, fluffy rice and mushrooms, seasoned with red wine and herb. And then how about starting the day off Maple Grove oatmeal, old-fashioned oats, maple flavoring with a pinch of brown sugar. This is what you want to do. 4-week emergency food kit, and that's just for you. Think about your children. I guarantee somebody around you is going to need help. You're going to want to at least have the 4-week emergency kit. Go to lancewallnau.com/patriot. Use that link, and you're going to get a special discount on their special 4-week emergency kit promotion. Okay, welcome back to this segment of the Lance Wallnau Show. Now, look, what I'm trying to say is that Israel is a placeholder in God's end-time plan. And when Jesus said, again, I guess it's in Luke chapter 19, when you hear of wars and of rumors of wars, see that you be not alarmed. It's amazing how, of all people that get traumatized, ironically, it's Christians. The people that should be worried are people that don't have faith, but it's the people of faith that are biting their nails the most for some reason. Probably because they know that there's an eschatological Armageddon, meltdown, global, all the stuff we talk about a global currency, the Great Reset, digital currency.
This portion is too hot to handle for social media. Go to lancewallnau.com/podcast to listen to the entire show.
Right now I'm noticing, for instance, with cards, everywhere I go with transactions, now you have the ability of the credit card, and, because I travel all over the place, now you can just kind of like bump it, right? You got this little, go ahead, you're smiling at me with your millennial smirk.
I'm thinking, don't hold your credit card up so people can see your number on it.
Oh.
But yeah, it's tap pay.
It's tap pay.
Next level is adding that card into your Apple Wallet and then tapping with your phone and paying.
And the next thing after that is, boom, just tap with your own ID on your wrist or your hand.
Let me scan your forehead. Boop. It's so convenient.
Scan the forehead. Well, listen, when I'm going through passports, it's like stand in front of the airport. Stand here in front of this thing or tap over here. What I'm saying is it sounds like I'm overreacting, but there's this gradual conditioning to the technological adjustments we make in order to do transactions. This is one step away from scan my hand, scan the palm, scan the forehead. Now, what happens when you have terrorism and people are groping for security? Well, unless you have this mark or this is built-in passport ID, you cannot travel, get on a plane, go into a country. You see how easily you can create a problem that is solved, and then people go along with a solution, even at the cost of individual freedom, which is the insidious nature of it's obvious now when you go to the airport. You're used to being herded like cattle. You go through your little cattle pen, you stand there, you get your eyes retinal scan, or you get your face picture, you check the ID, or you're bumping your card. It's all like setting up people to almost be processed. Now, I want to give you a verse, again, from the Bible here, which talks about the Gentile nations are, what does it mean when Jesus says that, the times the Gentiles are fulfilled? Well, you could say the times when Gentile history is dominating the world, and there's no relevance to Israel except tangentially in the formation of some empty geography that the Jews are going to be moving into and, battling with Bedouin Arabs over in 1947, or leading up to 47. What you have is a period of Gentiles dominating world history. Now history is going to be more or less constantly threading through the issue of Israel and the Middle East, so that the focus goes right back to Israel in the last days. There's a verse in Joel that you shared with me, Mercedes, which has to do with God gathering all the nations to the focal point of Jerusalem, which is basically what I'm saying. And this is all the way from the Old Testament. And do you have the verse there in Joel? What does that verse say? Joel chapter 3. I'll read it for you.
I got it.
I'm trying to get you like Natalie Winters. I want you to be ready to hand the batons handed off to you.
It's Joel 3:1. In those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat.
I will enter into judgment with them there on behalf of my people and my inheritance Israel, whom they scattered among the nations. And they have divided my land. They cast lots for my people. This dividing of land is one of the one of the things that creates tremendous anxiety amongst prophetically educated evangelicals, when they see peace accords like Bush was attempting to do, giving land away from Israel that God gave to Israel in order for Israel to have peace, then you see virtual judgment constantly coming upon nations that try to intervene in this situation in a way that robs Israel of what God had given to Israel as an inheritance. So this verse came to my mind when Donald Trump made the decision in 2017, when he restored the embassy, the authority of the United States backed Jerusalem's right to having Israel's right to have Jerusalem as the centerpiece of its capital and its government by moving our embassy there. The embassy move was a recognition by the world's dominant Gentile nation that Israel not only has a right to exist as a nation state, but its capital is Jerusalem. It's not a shared capital. It is the capital of the Jewish people in Israel. And that brought all the nations to the valley, so to speak, at the United Nations. And I was fascinated by how we had the first iteration of this prophecy. I will gather all the nations to a decision regarding what they will do with Israel. And all the nations were gathered at the United Nations for a decision on what they would do with Israel. And what was the result of that decision? How many nations?
It was 128 nations that rejected the move, and 9 nations stood in favor. And so if you want them, I can listen for you, but there's 9 that stood in favor. Guatemala, Honduras, Israel, Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, Nauru, Palau, Togo, and the United States.
6 of those nations were islands, by the way. It's curiously enough. They're not even major nations. They're just little island states. And the United Nations, Guatemala, and Honduras are 3 recognizable nations. But it's fascinating. It's kind of like the huge United States and like a couple of other nations stood with them. But 128 nations either voted against it or didn't want to vote at all because they didn't want to irritate any of their Muslim or Arab, neighbors.
35 nations abstained.
35, and so you have these, like I think of Australia. I was surprised. Nations that you think would be Christian nations and democracies would recognize the poor Jewish people have a right to exist. What are they, 8 million people in a globe of how many billion Muslims or something? Hundreds of millions of Muslims. So here you have, I think it's over 1 billion. So what you have is a cowardice in the globe regarding standing with Israel, which is why standing with Israel isn't really an economic decision. It's a moral decision, which is why it should shock you that 35 nations abstained and a total of 128 nations rejected, and only 9 nations, over 60% of them being micronations, small island nations, acknowledged the right of the Jew to have Jerusalem as the capital of their country. It's a statement. It's a preview of for the days will come when I restore the fortunes of Jerusalem and gather all the nations to make decisions. I don't think it's the last time you're going to have the UN gathering to make a decision regarding Israel. I think it's the first of probably 3 type of gatherings like that as we go into the end times. Now, there are 3 big lies that I want to talk about in this next segment that the West tells itself about Israel and Hamas. And I was looking at some Ben Shapiro commentary on this because, Ben is an interesting take on this because he's speaking as kind of like a Jewish intellectual, just looking at the facts. When you consider the fact that you've got campuses that'll freak out over microaggressions, remember this word. Remember the microaggressions? These small, you could read between the lines and read it as when you've got people where they're burned alive, shot in their bed, where they're lined up and executed, raped, tortured, and you have over like 100 of them being held hostage, you would think that these campuses that are so strong and vociferous about microaggressions would find an aggression. But instead of that, I think Americans are waking up to the fact that, my God, our campuses have been, we knew they were overtaken by leftist radicals, but it's such a slow awakening. And you have so many people that are like lawless leftists that kind of like shoulder shrug over the woke intersectionality, teaching that goes on. It's only now that I think people are beginning to realize when you've got Harvard and you've got universities and campuses that are coming out in defense of Hamas, and Hamas is nothing more than a brutal, indiscriminate killing machine, much like the Nazi swastika, that everybody is horrified and wants to affix onto the Christian nationalists or the right-wing Trump people. And here you've got your Nazi swastika virtually on the Hamas uniform in terms of their philosophy of annihilating the Jews and killing the innocent. But you don't see a lot of response to this. And what you're hearing about is this concern about having a proportional response, a humanitarian interest. When we come back, I want to catch the 1, 2, or 3 big lies that you're being told right now by leftist media in the West. As Israel goes to war, you need to know what these lies are.
Did you enjoy this latest episode? Please remember to share it with your friends, because the more knowledge you have, the better equipped you are to navigate the world.